to avoid any unnecessary disturbance to this committee's meeting. If you can start with apologies for absence, can I ask Teresa if we have apologies, please?
We have two apologies from Assembly Member Devenish and Assembly Member Dismal, and Assembly Member McCartney is substituting for Assembly Member Dismal today. In addition, the committee's Deputy Chairman, Sean Bailey, is running a little bit late, but will be here.
Okay, thanks for that, and thank you, Joanne, for reserving this afternoon. Any declarations of interest? Can I ask the committee note the recommendations about interest set out in item 2? And can I ask Assembly members to declare any other disclosable and pecuniary interest and other relevant interests, including any declarations in relation to gifts and hospitalities, which are not reflected on authorities' register of gifts and hospitality, where they relate to the items on the agenda for today's meeting. Are there any? Nope. Thank you. If you can move on to the next item, which are the minutes of meeting. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting of Regeneration Committee held on 11th of July 2017 to be signed by me as correct record? Thank you. I shall do so now. Okay. Actions taken under delegated authority. Can we note the actions taken by me under delegated authority I have following consultation with the Deputy Chair, namely to agree the scope and terms of reference for our investigation into convergence in London's growth boroughs, which we are discussing later on today. Thank you. Okay, if we can now move on to our main item for discussion, which is convergence in London's growth boroughs. For the viewers, just if I can explain, the purpose of this meeting is to examine what has been achieved and what remains to be done in 6 growth boroughs of East London to reach the objectives of convergence with the rest of London, which was indeed the Olympic legacy to start with. Members, can we note the terms of reference for this investigation? Thank you. Can I now welcome our guests to the meeting and invite them to introduce themselves? Can I also suggest that when you introduce yourself, you got up to about 10 minutes to briefly tell us about your role. We'll start with
10
Ron.
minutes?
I'll keep it.
I won't take 10 minutes.
Maximum 5
Nicky.
minutes, let's say. Okay. Or 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll keep it very quick.
All right.
I'm Rafe Ward. I apologize for pronouncing it Rafe, but I was named after my grandfather, so I also answer to Ralph. I've worked in planning and development and regeneration in London throughout my career. I'm just retired now from 1978. I worked for Hackney, London Borough of Hackney, I was the economic urban programme coordinator at Hackney in the 80s. And I moved to London Docklands for 3 or 4 years. I moved across to the Government Office for London in the interim when we didn't have a London administration, and was part of the team responsible for London planning. I wrote something called the Objective 2 strategy for East London. I was part of the very small team that appraised and ministers decide, but recommended SRB, Single Regeneration Budget. And then I went to work again for the government on the Thames Gateway project. And it was during that, it was about the early 2000s, and the Olympic bid was made, and I saw this happening and thought this is likely to win, actually. And then when we did win, because of my background and the involvement in Thames Gateway, Stratford being in Thames Gateway, supposedly, I took on full-time the role, I think I was called Olympic Planning and Regeneration Advisor in DCLG, which, although the management for the Olympics in government organisational terms was culture, media and sport, we became increasingly involved in the bid, both from the funding point of view, but also on the issue of legacy and regeneration legacy, because that was our departmental responsibility. And then I retired actually in 2011. I was made a professor, visiting professor at UEL, And through UEL, we still have a small group of people who we call the London Legacies Group that research and occasionally have seminars about issues of the impact of the Olympics. And I keep busy in various other planning ways, but I'm no longer involved in Olympic sort of related activity beyond that.
Thank you for that, Liz.
I was head of Regeneration in Hackney when we were putting the bid together, working with the GLA and the LDA to do that. And after leaving Hackney, I've been working off and on for originally the Host Boroughs Partnership and then the Growth Boroughs Partnership. I was working on putting the sort of forecasting together to help local people get into jobs during, like prior to the Olympics on construction and then during the Olympics. And then started working with the head of the Host Boroughs unit on the Convergence strategy. So I've written a couple of the last two Convergence strategies, and I've written the annual reports on Convergence as well. And in my spare time, I liaise with Rafe on the sort of local legacy, London Legacies group.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Graham Kinshot from Department for Communities and Local Government. I'm a Principal Research Officer in DCLG's sort of Central Analytical Unit, but between 2005 and 2012 I was the sort of DCLG's lead analyst for Thames Gateway and Olympics policy areas, which is where I know Rafe from, and I did some work with him when he was on secondment to the Host Boroughs unit. So I've led and commissioned a number of different studies on London 2012 legacy, including DCLG's evaluation framework and baseline, which I think I sent you a copy of prior to the meeting. Also worked collaboratively with colleagues at the then LDA and DCMS on their various sort of meta-evaluation cross-government work on the Olympics. Unfortunately, that project stopped sort of immediately post-2012. A number of different reasons why: change of government, change of ministerial teams. We devolved responsibility to the LLDC for sort of regeneration, any sort of evaluation of that. But I've still got strong sort of personal interest in it. As such, most of the information I'll give you will be historical, but my colleague Karen Irving, who will be joining us shortly, she's DCLG's sort of current lead on Thames Estuaries, it's now called, an Olympic sort of policy area. She works in the growth and places analysis team, so she can sort of give you the department's current view on that.
Thank you very much for that information. Again, just for the viewers on our webcast as well as here for clarification, the 6 participating boroughs, growth boroughs, are Parking and Dagenham. You got Greenwich, Hackney, Newham, Tar Hamlets and Waltham Forest. Those are the 6 growth boroughs part of this particularly legacy pledge. We did have a couple of representations expected from the boroughs. Unfortunately, they couldn't make it, but we shall be inviting them for their written response to our examination. So if I can start with the introductory question, and then other committee members have questions to ask to our guests present today. If I can start with Ralph, how was the vision for Convergence plan developed, and who were its main drivers?
Right. Well, I'll take you back. I think I have to take you back to the bid itself. The bid was very big on ambition. You'll probably remember it was very sort of grandiose, really. It was rather quieter on the question of why and how it was going to generate this sort of impact and regenerative impact, and very quiet on delivery, who was going to be responsible. When the bid was won, the responsibility sort of centred in onto the ODA, the Olympic Delivery Authority. You've got these, but their interest really was the site, you know, and legacy was starting to be interpreted as being what can we do with the site, and they did quite a good job actually. The LDA as well were getting involved in how some of the jobs being created there might be taken by local people. But the idea that it was going to be a bigger thing for East London, was getting a bit left behind, and how it could be a bigger thing. I was always puzzled how it could be a bigger thing for East London. The Olympic Games are a very small part of East London. Anyway, the penny was dropping that something perhaps more needed to be done to meet the aspirations of legacy and regeneration, both in DCLG and ministers in DCLG, but also I think with the mayor. And the LDA they brought someone in actually from Manchester, Tom Russell, who had been responsible for producing a very successful legacy plan for the Manchester Commonwealth Games. And he brought with him the idea of a strategic regeneration framework, an SRF. But his idea of the strategic regeneration framework, perfectly valid, but it was very much to do with investment in particular social facilities and programs and the like. The boroughs, I think, the host boroughs, felt that this was a bit more of the same. There's a blizzard of regeneration programs have been targeted. I mean, I've been involved in many of them on that part of London. Single regeneration budget, Stratford City Challenge, housing action trusts, and so forth and so on. And they felt, we've had all this, millions. I used to know what the figure was, millions. And we're still at the bottom of the pile. We've got to do this. This is time to think different and think bigger. And they wanted to use the Olympics really not as a driver of this, in the sense that there was some sort of project that was linked to the Olympics, but as a wake-up call. This was a threshold at which point London needed to wake up to the fact that it's had this area in the East for, well over a century, and it's time to think again. And the Olympics was had a sort of a significance of that kind, really, rather than a particular source of programs. Fundamentally, what they wanted to do was decide how we were going to address the problem of poverty in East London.
Yeah, what were the key targets? Deprivation?
Well, then the question was, how did we define those? And a report was drafted by some consultants, actually, Navigant, and they identified a series of indicators. They suggested these were a series of indicators which measure on a sub-regional level where the gap is between the conditions in East London and the conditions across London as a whole. Issues including sort of, levels of the employment rate, levels of unemployment, people living in the condition of homes and so forth. I can't remember exactly, but that's where they came from. And we looked at that list. I was at that point seconded from DCLG to the host borough unit, and I actually wrote a lot of the Convergence report eventually. But what we sought to do was try and build on beginnings of a program that might start to address some of those problems, whether or not they were kind of Olympic solutions. They were just, these are problems that needed to be solved. The report, we had about 2 months to write it. This is a problem that's been with London for a century or a half. We weren't trying to solve the problem. I mean, effectively what we were doing was writing a kind of manifesto and get everybody politically, the ministers, the mayor, the boroughs, to agree the sense that this needed to be a fundamental agenda for them. We scoped out some ideas of what that agenda might consist of, but we didn't pretend it was the last word. It got framed in terms of the concept of convergence was just an attractive way of capturing this sense of matching and meeting the gap between average London and East London. And it was also, the attraction of convergence was that it was a sort of measurable thing. I think one of the things the boroughs were concerned about is that, as I said, all these sort of programs were addressing different bits and pieces, but the overall sense of what was happening never came through. What was all this making a difference? That was the purpose of it, really. And so that's why we ended up with the Convergence report. And that became the SRF, the term SRF, which began with the LDA as a much different sort of animal, was continued to be adopted, but ended up in this rather different sort of agenda. I've still got it here, the Convergence plan. The intention was always that the Convergence plan was the first stage in developing a programme or series of programmes based on cooperation. Liz got involved and she's the one to talk about what happened subsequently. But that's the origin of the Convergence idea.
What are your thoughts about the overall program which was adopted formally, I think, in 2010? Then the whole process is planned for 20 years. Any thoughts on that in terms of its viability and how it's kind of rolled out now? And
well, I mean, the fundamental point, in my view, and different people have different views, the fundamental point, in my view, is that the Convergence programme measures outcomes. It doesn't measure the process, and we knew this in a sense when we did it. So how that outcome has come about, it doesn't measure. So if the area is converging because many of the people living there are leading more successful lives, great. But if it's converging because more people are moving in who happen to present, have higher incomes and better education, and that's just lost within the figures, then we're still converging, but actually there's still a lot of people being left behind. So I think that's always been to me a problem. I'm sure we're going to sort of talk more about that. Sure. And I think the only other thing I'd say, 20 years. I mean, 20 years is nothing. We're talking. I mean, the Inner Urban Programme began in 1978. Docklands began in 1981, and look at the Royal Docks. It's still got another 50 years to go. So, in regeneration, we always think in too short a term of timescale for all the right reasons. We want to make change. We want to bring benefit, but we're very unrealistic, I think, about the timescales that we use.
I see where you're coming from. Liz, do you want to add anything to what you heard?
So the first version of the Convergence strategy was sort of bigger and broader, and it had 7 different themes, and it was drafted before there was an austerity programme. So, but then when I became involved, we'd had the collapse of the banks, there was already less money in the public sector, so I sort of reined it in under 3 themes. And the boroughs decided they wanted to concentrate on employment in the economy and anti-poverty, better health outcomes, and better neighbourhoods that was around crime and transport and housing. So we sort of brought it in and had more. We had to review all the indicators as well, because at that point a number of the national performance set data was taken away, so boroughs weren't measuring some of the things we were originally measuring, so we had to start looking for other things that were being measured. And so the set of indicators you've got now aren't exactly the same as the original ones, because there's a number we couldn't continue to measure. And then by sort of 2015, we'd had more years of austerity and cuts, and there was less money and less levers local authorities had to do some of the work. So, for example, we'd been really successful on education indicators in terms of young people achieving qualifications, but at the same time, the local education authorities' roles were being sort of diminished and cut back. So I think that's the rest of the journey on that bit.
Sean, you wanted to comment?
Sorry, Ralph, just a quick question. You made the comment that the conversion plan only was looking at the outcomes. Was there any mechanism to capture the route to the outcome, the best practice, what things could be replicated? Because it strikes me, if you don't track that part, you then can't identify which parts are relevant because of the Olympic programme and which parts are relevant just because of the rest of the government's programme. Like, for instance, uplift in education, there was an uplift across all of London because the work had been going on for years.
So in the 11 to 15 strategy, we did have an action plan of actions we were going to take to try and meet sort of mid-term targets on the indicators. And again, in the 15 to 18 strategy, we also had an action plan of specific things we wanted to do to try and help impact on those indicators. So the subsequent 2 reports did have action plans going with them, though some of the actions were dependent on getting the resources together to do it, and not all of those resources ended up being forthcoming, so some bits of our action plans weren't achieved.
Could I ask, just at that point, to what extent the action plans were, the impact of the actions was measured, or whether actually you did the action and then you measured the outcome? So I think your point was having an understanding of exactly what contribution the different bits was actually making to the objective of convergence. And I don't know whether it, in fact, although we had the action plan, were the actions, so yeah, that's worked, that's done, and we'll do more of that, or that hasn't worked? Was it subject to that kind of scrutiny?
Some could be, and some couldn't. I mean, in the 15-18 strategy, we said we wanted 3 more river crossings.
Yeah.
Now, you know, it's in the current mayor's plan to have 3 more river crossings. They weren't the river crossings we'd said were our priorities, but, you know, one of them is. In terms of employment, we had achieved grant funding to do specific employment programmes, you know, like the LETIF, and more recently we've got European funding to do one. And of course, they have, as programmes, they all have specific outputs and targets that we need to achieve. And so we can say, yes, we've achieved those. But as you know, decades before, through SRB bids and City Challenge bids, East London's been very good at getting people into jobs, but that hasn't always impacted on the employment rate or the unemployment rate, because people move and people churn around in London, as I'm sure all you guys are more than aware of. So I'm not giving a neat answer, because there isn't a neat answer. There's a mixture of different things.
Yeah. Before I bring in Joanne, just a question to Graham, whether he wants to talk about the main targets for convergence and how they were chosen, you know, both at the time, and what do you think about it in terms of how it's working out now?
Yeah, I think I was only providing analytical support to Rafe when he was at Post Boroughs Unit, so I had limited involvement in that. But I think, just to reiterate Rafe's point about the distribution of benefits and the beneficiaries is crucial. I'm sure we'll come on to that later on. On the bit about the question about what process was involved in trying to achieve the convergence criteria, I think we did go through quite a lot of the sort of logic chains that were involved in trying to track what actions we will need to make to produce the results. It's often quite difficult to actually measure that unless you're doing some kind of, unless you've got a counterfactual comparison. But I think we'll probably come on to that later on as well.
Yep. Okay. Joanne, do you want to come in with your question?
My questions are to Liz about the growth borough partnerships. Then Nick is going to ask a little later about the role of the DCLG. But can I just start, Liz, by saying, what is the role of the London Boroughs Partnership, and how do you work across those boroughs and with other stakeholders?
The role of the partnership is to coordinate joint work across the 6 boroughs on actions to address convergence. So there's a lot of things boroughs are doing individually that might help impact on convergence too, but they're getting on with those individually. And the partnership is just looking at the joint activities we're doing together as 6 boroughs. We had a joint committee structure, and because of the sort of localism agenda and the devolution agenda at the moment, the 4 London sub-regions cut across the growth boroughs, so 4 are in one and 2 are in another. So that's impacted on the partnership's work. So At the moment, we're just concentrating on the two employment programmes that we're jointly delivering. So that's the sole focus of the partnership at the moment, and other bits of work have been put into hibernation until the two sub-regional partnerships are sort of fully up and running and can engage with those. But we have a quarterly employment and skills board that looks at the results of what's coming out of those employment programmes. On your list, you had a question about community engagement.
Yeah,
And
that's my next one. How you engage.
Yeah, as a
community.
partnership, we haven't worked on community engagement at a sub-6 borough partnership level, and that's been very much the role of boroughs to do the community engagement and to feed up what the communities want. So we haven't had any 6 borough conferences of at a local community level. We have had 6 borough sort of conferences that have involved different community groups and organisations, and for example, one of them was hosted by Toynbee Hall. But generally speaking, in terms of sort of grassroots community development work, we haven't done any of that. That's been left for the boroughs to do and to feed up to us. In terms of levers we've got to help deliver Convergence, as I sort of said earlier, the boroughs did have a lot more levers at the beginning of this process. They had a lot more funding at the beginning of this process, and they had, in some areas, they had a lot more powers. And so, in terms of levers, some of that has changed. At the same time, in terms of health and public health role that local authorities have taken on, they now have a few more levers than they had before. But again, as you know, the funding's been reduced, so that sort of dissipated some of that joint work that we were doing. So, I mean, there was a very good 6 borough programme on child health that some other boroughs joined in with us on as well. So I know, for example, Redbridge joined that piece of work on sort of childhood health and obesity. But, sorry, have I missed anything out?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I presume that the 6 borough working, you say you're moving to a common goal, and
Yes.
to also, I presume, you to share best practice and
Yeah.
do that. Is that still happening now, or did it ever happen?
No, it is. It has always happened in terms of employment work, especially. So, for example, you might be aware that Newham has an employment team called Workplace.
And we've had something to talk to us
Yeah.
about it.
And they're the sort of biggest of our 6 local labour delivery agencies, and you know the other boroughs have visited them. And I think when Workplace was first being set up, they were visiting Greenwich, because Greenwich had set up prior to Workplace, and so had Tower Hamlets is one. So in that way, they learned from each other, and we did have. We used to have some best practice work groups where we'd look at different aspects of joint work and different aspects of working on employment issues to look at how we could improve CRM, customer, basically systems for monitoring employment work and things like that. So
Can I
we
just
do
add to
share
that,
best
from the
practice.
days of when it was being put together, the assumption was not necessarily that there had to be joint working or joint working with 6. You know, it was per se. It was not. That was not sort of part of the philosophy of it. It was just that sense that there was a lot of shared problems. The world does not necessarily follow borough boundaries. Problems are not necessarily solved within borough boundaries. So the idea was, let's keep open this scope to work collaboratively. And it may be 1-2 boroughs rather than, you know, and so that was where that's where the strength was seen to come from. And I recall, you know, we in writing this thing, we got together with service heads of all the boroughs. I mean, we had a meeting of the service heads of the education, what was then the education, I don't know, we've got service, And all they said, look, we're doing fine on our own. There's nothing we can necessarily, they all said this, you know, nothing we can learn from, and fair enough. You know, just get on with it. I mean, the issues about education were probably things to do with housing quality, and that you might, I mean, what you'll find with this list of issues, they bear on each other, don't they? You know, the quality of the housing helps to determine how healthy you are, it helps to determine how successful your children can be at school, all that sort of thing. So it's an intermingling of things, quite sort of subtle. But the idea was, let's use this basic infrastructure of collaboration to then deploy it where it was most effective. I couldn't honestly say when we drafted that it worked in that way, you know. Collaboration is not, in my experience, working in Objective 2, doesn't come naturally, certainly to East London boroughs. So it was not something that sort of fell into place. But what it gave you was, as I said, it gave you this framework that you could use to deal with problems in a new and interesting and different way.
I mean, what might be useful after this meeting is if we can get from Liz perhaps a timeline. It seems, you know, there were certain strands you were working on and they seem to have fallen because of different issues, you know, when they were and when they were taken down. That would be very useful, I think, for us.
Sure.
I can say too.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Any other comments on what John has raised? Nope. Okay. In that case, Nikki, I think.
This question is for our participants from the Department of Communities and Local Government. And if I start with Karen Irving, if you could, and then go on.
Karen's not here.
Oh, Karen's not. Sorry, I thought. Oh, right, okay. Well, Graham then.
Graham will have
You're
to
going to show all of it.
fill the questions.
Sorry.
Yes.
Graham, what exactly was your role in working with the growth boroughs?
I was the analytical lead supporting Thames Gateway and Olympics Directorate, and they were our sort of policy directorate responsible for that. That's where Rafe worked. So we did the analytical support, and when Rafe went over to the host boroughs unit, I helped feed into the evidence base for that. So sort of limited involvement in the development of the Convergence. But what we did simultaneously is we developed the London 2012 valuation framework, sort of mainly based about regeneration indicators. But we did design that so it was complementary to the work that the host boroughs were doing. So it has sort of...
Sorry, what was it called? Can you just...
It's the evaluation framework. Basically, it's...
regeneration, you called it? Regeneration framework?
Because our department's responsibility is mainly for regeneration and communities aspects of Olympic legacy. Yeah. So what that is, it's a government Green Book compliant evaluation trying to measure the impacts of London 2012.
So if we wanted to find that document, what's it called?
It's published. There's a link to it in your pack.
Okay, fine.
The problem was, after we devolved policy responsibility to LLDC and ultimately the mayor, no further work was done by our department. But it does at least give a framework for which you can measure some of these sort of impacts over time, and some techniques for trying to work out how you might identify what might have happened anyway. So you're measuring the counterfactual case against what's actually happened.
Yes.
So measuring the net impact of the games.
That's very interesting. And you've mentioned counterfactuals twice now. I think that's really important, and we'll find out, I guess, as we go on with the meeting.
Aside to that, I mean, from my point of view, Graham was the sort of reference, as an expert in measurement and analysis, was my reference point as we were putting this together in terms of the relevance of the measures that we'd selected and the like. And just one other interesting thing, it wasn't actually Graham, but your team, who, when we said we want to converge to the London average, and I asked, well, what's a London average borough look like? What's a borough which hits the average sort of measure? And the answer is Ealing, interesting enough. I don't mean that in any pejorative way, but so that was a sense of Ealing being. I find that quite an interesting one because no part of East London reminds me of Ealing. But so I'm not saying geographically, obviously, but in terms of the mix and the economic and social structure of the place, you know.
Yeah.
But it was that kind of advice that
So the role was really at a distance anyway. It was in terms of...
So in terms of your question about what policy levers we have now,
Yes.
DCLG, it's probably limited because they go through the mayor. But my colleague Karen works in our growth and places analysis team, so she's got a responsibility for wider scale regeneration. We both work in the analytical team, so we do have some resources, albeit finite, to work on sort of joint projects. But obviously it's not a bottomless pit. But if there were opportunities for sort of joint working or just feeding in comments and advice on projects that GLA or other bodies or the host boroughs wanted to do, we can sometimes arrange that.
Right. Can I just ask you, Graham, because while all this has been going on, it's been a moving picture in terms of, some of it's been mentioned, in terms of, things have changed, the climate's changed. How much do you take account of reforms in terms of welfare, in terms of housing and planning policy, when you're doing your frameworks and when you're looking at broken places and so on?
That would be difficult in that, because the evaluation framework was developed prior to, when would it have been done? Probably developed 2010, most of the work was done. And
so at the beginning of a...
Yeah, so the welfare reforms
in...
and the Olympic schools would happen after then. I think it would just have to be adapted ongoing to try and work out what would happen there, because I read in the pack some of the comments from Kirby Swales about people being displaced to outer London boroughs, and that will impact on the sort of the demographics of the borough. The other thing we do measure, we measure the indices of multiple deprivation as well, which is a useful sort of guide, and that will obviously feed into the convergent criteria going forward, I would have thought. But it is a difficult one to track. So many different things going, as well as sort of welfare reforms and things like that. You've got huge sort of churn in the boroughs as well, because all new housing being sort of made available in the host boroughs around the Olympic site and places like that. So it is like a moving target all the time.
Exact science.
Yeah, you can only do what you can do in something like that.
Yes. No, I understand. Thank you.
Anything else, Vicky, from
No,
you?
no.
Okay. Sean, your questions about Convergence report on 2015 and so on.
The latest Convergence report indicates that less than half of the indicators will actually be hit on time. And I wondered what your perspective was onto why that is the situation and what could be done to turn that around.
Well, I've got a very early version of the sort of 16-17 indicators, and that does show a better picture than the 15-16, surprisingly. So a lot of them look like they're on track to meet their 2020 targets now, and the latest information that I'll be able to share once this has all been verified. The ones that aren't, median earnings, the level of it, although employment rates have increased, median earnings in the growth boroughs have not kept up with the London average at all, and that's looking like it certainly won't be met. Job density also, and obesity levels in children in year 6 all look like, well, the gap's actually not changed, or it's widened since the baseline year in 2009. Something I was discussing with the sort of group of health, the health group that have been working up until 2 years ago on this, we were expecting austerity to start impacting on life expectancy, and it has now. In the latest data for women, life expectancy for the first time has decreased slightly, which is what we would have expected if you're thinking about poorer, older women that are very reliant on public sector resources. So that has changed. Both Rafe and Graham have talked about our inability to sort of look under some of the indicators. And we had tried, in terms of the employment rate and the unemployment rate, to see what was happening. We didn't have resources. I mean, originally with DCMS and DCLG, we had been talking about doing a piece of research that, together with the host boroughs and GLA, we had wanted to do a piece of research that would look at the population of 2009 and how the Olympics had impacted on them and taken into account counterfactual things, and the resources to do that all disappeared. So we were then trying to think through, well, what other ways can we look at things in a more sort of fine-grained level? And in the last annual report and in the new one that will be coming out, we're trying to look at benefit levels and numbers of people on benefits rather than as a percentage. Now, if you do that, again, welfare reforms, if they are reforms, impact on that as well, because some people aren't joining what's called JSA, they're now going on to universal credit, and so it's very difficult to map. But generally speaking, the numbers of people on JSA have gone down, so you can say, and that's what the unemployment rate is based on, so we can say the unemployment rate has really reduced and therefore the target's green. But if we actually look at those numbers and look at the numbers of people that are on invalidity benefits or other out of work indicators, those numbers have gone up hugely, absolutely massively. And if you add those two numbers together, there's been no change since 2009. So we know that although the indicator's green, there's something else going on underneath, and we haven't got the sort of time and resources to really go into that properly, but we know it's not as rosy as maybe the fact that the indicator's green makes it look.
Just to cut in there, I understand it, because on one sense you could look at these indicators and say that actually there has been some failure here. Because, for instance, your comment about the reduction in life expectancy for women, the whole goal, I would imagine, would be to help those women move away from welfare so they weren't so dependent on it. But I have some sympathy because...
Well, it's also the health service, it's not just welfare.
Okay, I understand that. But I wonder as well, is some of the impact because of a comment you made earlier about churn? Because the comment you made about none of East London looking like Ealing, I now live in East and know that to be an actual fact. Is there some historical fact? I think the point I'm trying to make is some of this work, the fruit will be borne out years into the future. Because if you've impacted how well children are being raised, they have better levels of education. Yeah. I just wonder, when this whole thing was constructed, why we didn't put the resource in to look deeper into these situations.
Well, there was the intention, but because of all the different cuts to public sector budgets in central government and in local government, those resources have gone.
But is it always about money? If you're involved in politics at any point, everybody wants more money. The fire brigade, other parts of the public sector. It strikes me that some of this, a comment was made earlier that we were only looking at the outcomes, not the route to the outcome. And at least my second question is, are there particular boroughs within the change boroughs that are struggling, or is it across the board?
In terms of boroughs that have gone down the deprivation table, I think Barking and Dagenham's probably the case in point, because they had quite cheap rents. So when the sort of benefit caps were coming in central London, or coming in across the whole country, but were impacting on families in central London moving, Barking and Dagenham was a sort of net recipient of people from central London in a way that some of the other boroughs were only in patches because their rent levels were already so high. Yeah. And you could say that some of the... I mean, we haven't got absolute cast iron evidence, but the general belief is that some of those additional deprivation indices profiles that have declined in Barking and Dagenham are due to some of the benefit cap issues.
Okay, I see you say.
Then, at one point, they were looking at whether it was the Olympics that had impacted on sort of property prices in East London. And there is some evidence of that in Stratford, but in other areas, for example, Waltham Forest, where that's happened, it looks like it's more waves up from Hackney.
Yeah,
and just
the general rippling of
yeah,
London.
rather
It's why
than
I
an
came
Olympic
from west
factor.
to east.
Yeah, so there are some areas around the Olympic site that look like they're impacted by the Olympics, but that isn't so wide. I think the general London ripple sort of washes over that.
So there's no indication that, because there's no doubt in anybody's mind that the Olympics has at least beautified that particular point. Surely that's had, and you're saying that's had an effect locally, but there's no evidence beyond that.
There's no evidence of it impacting on house prices beyond a sort of fringe around the Olympic Park. So, you know, there's bits of the growth boroughs that are quite far away from the Olympic Park, so there's no evidence that anything in the Olympics is impacted on Chingford, for example, or on South Greenwich.
So my final question would be, it seems quite crass, this question, in my opinion. Are these boroughs on target to be net contributors to the UK economy?
Some are becoming that. So, I mean, we added in only about 3 years ago an indicator on job density, and I've not got the information in front of me, but obviously Tower Hamlets is a net contributor now, because Canary Wharf is in Tower Hamlets, and there have been the job density levels in Hackney have also grown sort of beyond the London average, from memory. I think I'm right, but that we're yet to see that happen in Newham in terms of the docks, and it's yet to happen in Barking and Dagenham. So there are bits of the growth boroughs that are definitely becoming net contributors.
It strikes me as a slightly strange measure, because I believe they are, because they allow people somewhere to live. So lots of people live there who work elsewhere in London.
Yeah.
And also, I was originally a West Londoner, and now I've become an East Londoner. And if it wasn't for East London, I'd probably be sleeping under a bridge. So I'm not sure how that measure is. Is it an important measure? Is it something that is at the top of your list of things that needs to be
It's not
changed?
on the top of our list. I mean, it was only introduced about 3 years ago when we were looking to see how could we measure growth, because how could we measure job growth, and job density is the measure for job growth. So yes, I mean, some bits of London are the sort of dormitories for the other bits of London, and as a East London resident as well, yes, I couldn't afford to live
In Ely. It was one of
any
the
other bit.
objectives lying behind the sort of the original Convergence aspiration, that it should be East London should become more of a wealth generator. And a study was done by Oxford Economics, I've got it somewhere, that you know, it demonstrated the sort of wealth the area could potentially generate if its economy could be modernised. And that's what's happening, actually. And in the Olympic Park, I'm not saying, you've got things like the Here East Media and Digital Technology Centre and the like. So this is happening, and it was one of the objectives. But one of the issues about regeneration is that exactly what regeneration means is a very opaque thing. I mean, some people talk about regeneration and they mean attracting private investment and lots of new wealth-creating business. Some people talk about regeneration and they're talking about people and poverty and equity. And these, and often these definitions are used interchangeably. So people are talking about regeneration, but they're talking about two completely different processes. So it's and actually, to some extent, these not necessarily, they don't necessarily fit together. Because if you create a successful place which people want to move into, you raise prices, and that makes it more difficult for the poor people to compete with newcomers. So it's a very sort of complex area. And one of the problems, so you say, with the Olympics and regeneration, I always felt it tends to conflate these things. You know, to assume that, I mean, what the point you made is it's a better place around. But, well, what difference does that have on someone who's living at the top of a tower block sort of question? They've got a better place to shop. Maybe they're, certainly, anecdotally, the young people I know in that area are much prouder and more motivated, actually, as a result of living in what's clearly a successful place. I tend to feel that. I think you do need, as part of regeneration, to make a place successful. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're tackling some of the issues of poverty. And you might actually be making some issues more difficult. I mean, one of the possible outcomes, what's happening in East London at the moment, where lots of new housing is being developed, quite expensive new housing is developed in improbable areas in Royal Docks and Canning Town, which were never associated. You're creating potentially some quite dramatic combinations of poverty and wealth. We've always talked about the juxtaposition of poverty and wealth in London being close by. And you might be creating some quite extraordinary examples of that in East London. I don't think we really know that yet. And this sort of sub-regional statistics that we're talking about doesn't throw any light on that. That's something which I certainly, if I was still around in this business, I'd be looking to try and do. There's a whole range of getting underneath and into what's happening, which is, I think, really would be really valuable to you to help to decide, you know, where do we go next? Because one of the questions to me is, I find it extraordinary so many of these things are green. You know, I've been working in this area for 40 years. All of a sudden they're going green. Why? Why is that? And what's the cause? What's the cause of that?
But that's why I'm so interested.
You know,
in
and I think we need to understand those causes confidently, and then to repeat them. It may be the Olympics in part, or it may be, I don't know, and it's, you know, it may be better management by the boroughs, or it may be, it certainly isn't more money. The extraordinary thing is they're going green when going through austerity. You know,
well,
so it raises. So I would look at this and saying, well, that's impressive that you've got so many greens. Why are they going green? You know, what can we learn from that? Do you see what I mean?
I do. It's a good point.
But we do have, just as you know, more people on out of work benefits that are illness related, and you know, the job density figure is quite important when you're looking at very marginalised communities or people with quite chaotic lifestyles. Because from work I've been involved with in getting families and families with intergenerational unemployment into the workplace, it's really important to have some local jobs, because trying to get people motivated to travel across London for a job, for their first job, is really, really difficult. So you do need local jobs if you are going to tackle sort of intergenerational worklessness.
Yes, I used to run a job club, and I saw that you couldn't start with the big job far away. You had to build up to it. Thank you. I'll hand you over to the chair.
Nikki.
I just wondered, Rafe and Liz, whether from the beginning or during this process we've involved academia, because it seems to me listening, it would be, perhaps it's happened, very, very important to have a university or even more than one on side tracking some of this and really helping.
I agree with you absolutely. I mean, the
I just
reason we didn't, well, we employed 2 or 3 different consultants, and we've got the reports to try and explore where the first report was, what kind of impact can Olympic Games have on poverty? You know, famously the Olympics was plonked in the middle of this mass of intense deprivation, as if that meant something. But I mean, what does it actually mean? I mean, when you ask that question, it starts. No, I agree. We did some reports. When we actually came to write the report, I mean, I spoke to as many people who understood this, and I've got quite a few decent networks at Birkbeck and LSE, UEL, and but we didn't really deploy them. We didn't have time. It was as simple as that. We had to get this thing done, the Convergence report. The whole idea was then subsequently it would be developed and refined. I think it would be fascinating. I mean, we recently, as part of, well, it was UEL, And I think that's what, in some sense, prompted this. We had some academics coming in to explore what is happening in East London, because we found it fascinating that Barking was going down, Tower Hamlets was going up. You know.
Is there scope? Well, there's still scope to do that, in fact.
Absolutely.
If we're going to learn lessons.
Frankly, Nikki, I think it's absolutely fundamental.
Yeah.
I think
Graham?
I mean,
fundamental.
UEL have been involved, and Professor Alan Brimacombe had, via UEL, had been commissioned by the Olympic Authority itself to do a report on the impact of the Olympics, and that came out a year and a half
About a
ago.
year ago, yeah.
And there are other people in UEL that have been commissioned by the growth boroughs to do different pieces of work on specific aspects. And I am in email correspondence, and I've got an overdue meeting with somebody from UEL to talk about sort of possibly taking over the monitoring of some of these convergence indicators. So that is outstanding, and support in that from the GLA would be great. I mean, at the moment, each year when I do the annual report, I work with someone in the GLA intelligence unit who sort of quality audits all of the sort of the indicator work and the graphs and charts, and so I work very closely with someone in that so that it's all validated and sort of signed off by the GLA as well as by the growth boroughs.
And Graham, could I just ask you, did DCLG or does DCLG involve academia, and have they?
We did at the time. We commissioned a number of different studies, some from private sector consultants, some from our expert panels of academics. We involved colleagues from LSE on population churn in the host boroughs and things like that, and colleagues from UEL, Gavin Pointer and Ian McCrory did a number of think pieces for us, not only on host boroughs work, but also in preparation for the OECD review of Olympic legacy as well.
That's interesting. Sounds to me as though maybe there's scope for a commission to kind of bring all this together and then see what the gaps are.
There is.
More needs to be done.
I think it'd be a very interesting one to do, but given it's not really within DCLG's remit at the moment, and given the priority on housing and the aftermath of Grenfell and things like that, it's probably not one DCLG could lead on. But it's certainly one we could feed into if there was an appetite to do that.
Okay.
Liz mentioned one area of research, didn't you, which was about to be begun, but then was not able to be funded. Is looking at what's happening to people. What's happening to people in the host boroughs who live there? Are they benefiting? Are they the people getting the jobs? Are they the people, or are they actually being their own poor statistics, unfortunate, unlucky statistics, being submerged within lots of middle class? I mean, anecdotally, one of my old friends, his son is buying a house in Leighton. 5-10 years ago, he wouldn't have gone anywhere near Leighton. You know, this is what's happening at the moment in London, and that's not necessarily benefiting, or is it? I don't know. Maybe it's a good thing that London is balancing out, and I think probably it's a legitimate objective for London to try and find a balance. Economically, it's important because you release the economic potential of East London. If businesses will invest in East London, and they'll see that, then jobs, local jobs, it's got space-hungry organisations move to East London. So it's important, and it's probably important for London to have boroughs that are broadly similar in its structure. You don't have these huge concentrations of relative deprivation. And so that may be a strategic objective, actually. And I think to some extent it's a strategic objective of the convergence idea. Implicitly, it's a strategic objective of convergence, because that's what convergence means. We're all the same. But what that doesn't address is the question of who's left behind in that process. And that's the fundamental issue which I think we need to understand in all this. And it seems to me with the housing market as it is, market in inverted commas, and the complete dearth of affordable housing in a serious sense, you know, we've got a fundamental problem to deal with.
Also, I was just thinking, it doesn't... Sean mentioned churn. I don't know if we know enough about demographic change. You know,
We did
and
a
the
report.
displacement factor. I don't know if we know enough about that.
The Host Borough Unit did a report, admittedly it's 2011, but it was Christine Whitehead from LSE, who's, you know, the expert on this, which I could probably dig out, but it's to try and explore this issue of churn. People, you know, people's opportunities growing and then they move out.
Yes.
And one of the objectives, you know, in East London is for people to stay.
And another thing I would say is although in our briefing we've got figures on how many more social homes there are, what we don't know is how many we've lost.
Yes.
And I think some of that needs to be looked at, Chair. But I've finished.
Okay, before we move on to the next topic, I just want to get a bit clearer or sharper kind of information, if you're able to kind of give your own sort of views from experience you have being on this particular project. We had the sort of program founded in 2010, which is like 7 years ago. We had the strategy, convergence strategy agreed, sort of refreshed and all of that, which is for 2015 to 18, and that was endorsed by all parties concerned, including the GLA, and there's action plan. So given where we are 7 years on and with this strategy, are we able to actually identify which are the boroughs, host boroughs, which have been clearly successful, and the boroughs which are facing challenges and therefore lagging behind? Are we able to actually pinpoint that? That's what I'm after. Liz, do you want to?
Yeah, I think you can. The borough that's had the biggest change against the indicators on employment and unemployment is Newham. And you could say that's a number of factors, but the fact the Olympic Park is sort of 60-70% in Newham, you could say contributes to that. Then again, Newham has also invested, as a borough, it's also invested the most in its local labour brokerage. But in terms of positive change, Newham's the one that has changed the most in terms of the sort of economic profile of the borough. And Barking and Dagenham's the one that's
at the other end.
Gone the other end. Though that's also improved in some areas, but it's changes the least.
Any other thoughts on this?
No, I would simply say it would need to be monitored. And I've no idea what sort of monitoring that the GLA does. I'm not in that, on the impact of its programmes and the collective impact of investment in these areas. I think it would be very worthwhile to do that, not simply to count numbers, but to develop some sort of sense of where the impacts are falling in a constructive way, rather than...
Okay, Joe, your question.
I think in part my question's sort of been answered, and that is really how much of the broader growth rates of these boroughs we can put down to the Olympic effect, or just what's happening in London generally. I mean, we do know from some boroughs, they say, well, actually, a lot of the regeneration has come a lot quicker because of the Olympics. We've got our train lines, our better roads, the better whatever. But apart from that, is there anything you can say is a particular Olympic effect?
Definitely. In 2011 and 2012, the Olympics provided a cushion in terms of employment in that bit of London, because some of the metadata work with DCMS and DCLG, we were looking at other comparable areas that had comparable levels of deprivation to the growth boroughs. And, we know that whenever there's a big downturn in the economy, the poorer places sort of, it hits them first. And it didn't hit the growth boroughs first. So there was definitely an Olympic cushion in 2011 and 2012. And then that sort of fell away in 2013. So in terms of an Olympic impact, yes, things have sped up. You know, the overground network is really, really good now. And that happened faster because of the Olympics, the East London line, you know, the whole sort of outer circle. And there was that Olympic cushion, which I think then helped that area spring forward faster as a result.
But the indicators we have from the original Convergence targets, is there any way of singling out which ones and in what proportion they are as a result of the Olympics coming to East London?
Graham, this is a technical question,
Yeah.
methodological question.
It is a very difficult question. Over time, what you'd have to do is revisit some of the work that Amiens did when they devised our evaluation framework and the DCMS meta-evaluation cross-government sort of framework, and do some sort of nearest neighbour analysis, like how a comparable borough, either inside or outside London, did against, who didn't have the advantage of having the Olympics on their doorstep, did against, you know, the host boroughs. So what you'd need to do is reactivate those kinds of evaluation frameworks to kind of measure the effects. Obviously it won't be perfect because of the issues we discussed earlier. There's a lot of white noise, changing demographics, changing structure of the economy, and people coming in through different sort of routes into the boroughs. But that's probably the only way you'll get an anything like accurate answer to your question. I mean, it wouldn't be cheap to do, and it wouldn't be all that quick either, but at least there's a framework you can do to use it, because we've got the baseline data as well. And it's not one that needs to be done necessarily by a consultant or anything. Maybe it could be done in-house by GLA, maybe sponsoring PhD students to do it, something like that, with one of the local universities. But it'd be a very interesting project to do.
Can I say, in one sense, I hope not very much is attributable to the Olympics. Otherwise, to do any more, we've got to have another bloody Olympic Games in East London. I think one's enough for one lifetime. But no, I think less statistical, and I always thought about this in sort of causal way. What's commonsensically causal? I mean, it seems to me that the market in East London, the image of East London, as everyone says, has radically changed. I mean, the idea of the V&A and the Smithsonian, or going to East London, going beyond the Lee. I mean, the River Lee, the old boundary of London, was always, you know, the edge of civilization as far as the government. And so to get beyond that is an extraordinary change. And where that's going to take us in terms of further spin-offs is an interesting question. Local livability, we've talked about. I mean, the local livability in that part of London, and probably that area with Stratford City and the like, and the park, and is strikingly improved. So how do people respond to that? I'm not sure, but you know, new businesses. New businesses are moving in there. I mean, you've got the new businesses in the here east, the new businesses all over further down in the Royal Docks, with multipliers that generates. So yes, that's and new housing, and who there's a lot of that new housing being occupied by wealthier people, maybe from outside East London, but they're bringing money with them, and they're spending that money. So there is a kind of, to me, there's quite. I think, you know, I was always, as you can probably tell, I was something of a skeptic about the Olympics, but I feel now that I don't know how you measure all these things, as Graham says, but I think kind of a priori it's commonsensical that it will be having quite a big impact. And the interesting though is then how you build on that. Maybe you leave the market. That's what it's good at, is to build on that. From my point of view, then you think about the things the market can't deliver. And there's a lot of people living in East London who are outside reach of the market, really, in terms of housing and the like. And that's where the priority now lies. I mean, this may sound absurd, but you know, over the years I've worked on a lot of desperate regeneration projects, as Nikki will know, you know, which now it's a question of trying to keep the lid on them. You know, whether it's Hackney and good old Broadway Market, which I remember when it was a complete empty series of shops, and now it's just heaving with rich young cyclists, you know, or the South Bank, you know, trying to get the South Bank moving back in the 1980s. It seemed to be an impossible task. Now it's a question of managing this stuff that sprouts. So, you know, the same in parts of East London may be happening, and it may be a management exercise we've got now to deal with in East London. And then we need to perhaps refocus our attention, or you need to refocus your attention on where that market regeneration process is not the bits it isn't going to reach. Because there are going to be a lot of people in East London who are not going to be reached. This could be bright green, but it still ain't reaching some of the people who were promised. That's what the legacy promises was really all about. They were promised a change in their lives, and actually they're being turfed out to Stoke or beyond. You know, that's what's going on.
Thank you.
Okay, Sean has a number of detailed questions, please.
I want to start by saying the Olympics is 5 years gone. 5 years after the Olympics, how do we keep the momentum going with this convergent programme? Do things need to change? Do the goals need to change? I'm quite captured by this idea of churn. Are some of the boroughs suffering because they're collecting the poor from across London, because East London is the last place people can actually afford to live? Does that need to be taken more into account in how we keep the momentum going forward? Do we focus on just economic growth? Do we cater to people who can't access the market for whatever reason? What needs to be the focus moving ahead?
I think it probably does need to be on the people who might have been left behind, or, you know, have probably been left behind. And as I think we've established through the discussions, the indicators as they sit without the ability to go drill down deeper don't really get us to that. But that should be the next sort of focus.
Is there other things happening in London in this building? This building does tons of research and is involved in communities across London in many ways. Is there something that we could be giving to you to help that research happen? Is there historical data that could be used to judge that against? I think the clear question is, what else could the Mayor be doing to help? Is there something new you'd ask of the Mayor?
I think if we could set up a sort of research, a body of work, and start looking at how we could get perhaps PhD students involved, and, you know, to do it all on a low budget, and your own staff to support that, that would be
What would you want to
a good
look at?
start. And then from the research we could start making a case for how we do sort of drill down locally to the people that might have been left behind. I mean, some of the work we're doing currently on the employment strategy, we are trying to do that on the European programme. But there will always be people who are missed.
Sorry, go ahead, Ralph.
You know, there's always a lot of work underway, good work underway actually, on finding and trying to reach this community, for want of a better word. It's been going for the last 25, 30, 40 years really in boroughs, and I'd say some very good work. Some very good work was done by the LDA back in the day about the Olympics, and excellent work by Newham in JobLink or whatever it's called, and getting people engaged with the world of work and all that sort of stuff. So quite a lot is going on. I suppose it's making, what I would say is following up the sort of the aspirations of the Convergence programme, rather than the kind of literal measurement, because as we've been saying, to some extent the literal measurement has its sort of flaws, so to speak. It's saying, well, how do we collectively deal with this problem? And it's fair to say, actually, it's not just in East London. It's, you know, I think the second most deprived borough is in West London. Well, it certainly was when I was not surprisingly, in Kensington, North Kensington, when I was working. So there are problems which are, it's about poverty. I mean, I think the issue probably is to think about less about geography and more about poverty. And and get to understand better what is actually happening amongst those communities. As Nick said, I mean, we're very proud of our academic presence here in London. You know, we have got some excellent. Let's use that. Let's, you say, I'm sure you do. I'm sure you've got working groups of academics, but let's bring them to bear on knowledge about poverty in London. That's what the Convergence report was all about. And it chose the geography of East London because that's the geography that's always been with us since the middle of the 19th century, really. And that's probably the place to start. But let's not obsess with that geography. Let's, I think, focus on people and poverty rather than geography is what I would urge. And for you to deploy your power, your influence, to get into these sort of issues in a much clearer way, and being to understand that where the impacts are working. Let's say they're going on. There's all sorts of programs underway with health and employment and the like, you know.
Because for us in this building, the Olympic Park, the Olympics as an event provides a very clear focus, and any lessons learned from that can be applied across London. So the direct question is, if we were to look at that, what would you want to look at, Liz? I'm addressing this to you as well. What would you want to look at? What would you want the Mayor to put his finger on and say, these are the issues we want to appear in Convergence, in a new Convergence strategy, because not only are they important in East London, but they have application across all of London. I myself come from Shepherd's Bush, and I now live in Romford, which is miles, they're miles apart. There isn't any difference in the people. I don't think, well, you're a poor East Londoner and it works out differently for you. Poor people are poor people. But the point about the Olympics, I was slightly sceptical in the beginning, but I do believe that it's helped the gravity move slightly east. And now there's technical things that we want to learn. What is it we should be asking? What questions should we be asking? Which groups should we focus on? And what outcomes are we after? What bits can be transferred? Because anything that works in East London will be greatly received in Shepherd's Bush, Hammersmith or anywhere else.
I mean, it's hard to say any one thing. For example, workplace in Newham has been very successful, but if it hadn't had Westfield and the Olympic Park on its doorstep, it wouldn't have been as successful. You know, the job brokers there would have been having to make far more contacts across all of London. They wouldn't have been able to have sort of a fewer bigger employers that they could work with and get people from being not at all job ready to into work. So, sorry, I'm not giving you any answers. No. I'm just saying it's quite complex.
I think that the key problem we've got is in terms of who benefits from the Games. So when all the job opportunities came around from the Olympic Park, Stratford City and things like that, it's where did those jobs go? What was the distribution like? Did they go to local people who'd lived in the area and been in deprived communities for years? Or did they go to people from outside? That's where we need more of the individual lower level data to work that out and see if it actually helped to transform individual lives of sort of deprived communities in the vicinity of the Games.
That's a specific thing we could be asking of the Mayor, because we have two very big developments. You have Red Cross coming up, they're doing a lot of work, and if we can learn the lessons about who was avoided. Reading this paper makes quite uncomfortable reading when you look at the part where all the people applied for the jobs in Waitrose and John Lewis and felt that there wasn't enough, you know, that they didn't benefit. I have friends who live in Leighton and the like, and they feel like it went well for people outside of Leighton because you created a lot of high-paying jobs that other people came and took from them, and we need to learn those lessons and capture them, because there's the other end where it went really well, where you did create that event, that moment that brought in a lot of employers, but we can replicate it with maybe what's going on at Old Oak Common, what's going on at Red Cross, as long as the Mayor is directed as to what we need to capture and what bits we need to try and replicate across London.
A lot of the jobs did go to local people in terms of regeneration programmes, and the sort of average percentage of jobs going to long-term unemployed local people. The Olympics was successful. It was comparatively successful. In terms of the jobs during Games time, a lot of young people who hadn't had jobs before, they might have been students away at university but worked that summer, all got good work experience, earned some money, and it supported their CVs, and also a number of long-term unemployed local people who were older than that got jobs during that time. Had we had longer to plan it, I mean, if all the money that went to the Olympics, if you were given that to regenerate East London, could you have done better? Of course you could. It would take a lot longer. But would we have ever been given that money to regenerate East London? Absolutely no way. But I think what we can learn from it and from Convergence is that it's good to have really big, ambitious targets. I mean, the idea of East London converging with the average for London is pretty epic. And over the years, I've had arguments with people, regeneration professionals, that just get a stupid idea. You can't ever do that. It's East London, for goodness sake. And I said, some people thought you could never have a national health service. We've got a national health service. Yes, it took a long time, and that, there had to be certain political things that all happened to be in a good order and a good place for it to take place. But if you are ambitious and you do give it enough time, I mean, for Convergence to happen, the target is 2030, not 2020. We've got mid-term targets for 2020. So, it was a long-term plan for over 20 years. But the biggest problem, and what we're sort of failing from now, the Olympics is over, there was excitement after it, but a 20-year plan takes sort of long-term commitment, and different partnerships then happen, and, different governments come in and out, and to have a 20-year strategy is a really hard thing to do in terms of, this country, which isn't particularly great at very long-term planning. And, we don't do long-term budgetary planning, and, I think that is a big, big hurdle for long-term projects.
Make a point as well? I've been thinking. What the Olympics, what was interesting about the Olympics, really, I think, is that it tried to combine a big piece of urban investment and urban change and urban growth with social benefit. Bringing those two things together. We talk about it a lot, but we don't really. And what we tried to put in place machinery to do that through the LDA and the job link, and so that the jobs would be beneficial locally, rather than just the Canary Wharf. I'm sensitive because I was working on Canary Wharf at the time, but Canary Wharf famously didn't make a great deal of job outreach to local people, though it does now. But that's what the Olympics did. And I have to say, that's what we used to do in Government Office for London with SRB. We used to dump big SRB budgets on King's Cross, on Battersea, on Stratford, all the areas where there was going to be big physical growth. We tried to support and bolster those areas and those local authorities with big slugs, 30 million. The fact is, the development never happened in the right. It never got synchronised in time. King's Cross is coming along now, whereas the partnership was funded. But I think that's an interesting. I think that's the right. Personally, I think that's the right way of managing this. The mayor talks about good growth. Well, good growth is about many things, but one of the issues to me about good growth is linking investment and growth to social and local social benefit. I think your point about moving long distance if your first job is a killer, really. So that sort of strategy. I don't really know, I'm ashamed to say, exactly what kind of money the mayor has to deploy. for us for the regeneration. We had multiple millions. We didn't realise how lucky we were in the days of SRB. You know, we were struggling to find good projects to give it to, if I'm honest with you. You know, if you could develop a model which built on some of the experience of the host boroughs that have sought to do this, and it may not be on such a giant sub-regional level, it may be on a more local level, it may be on a purely borough level, depending on the geography, that engages the developers and the future employers with the local population and builds those sort of links. In a way in which people feel this is part of their world rather than an alien world that's coming to dump itself on their doorstep. That strikes me as being one way of perhaps learning from the experience, because I do think, I mean, you look at the park, and the park is full of local people. I know that the LLDC have done studies on this, and they are. I'm not quite sure. Maybe the LLDC describe local as anyone who comes from the southeast of England. I don't know, but well, no, the LLDC they probably do. But no, it's local. It's local. And you can just see, you know, the ethnic mix of the people using the park. It's a local event. People, and Stratford City, people feel it's theirs. And that's an interesting thing. And how one can recreate that sort of local impact, which does, in my anecdotal experience, is reflected in certainly in young people's sense of they live in a good place, and how that translates into sense of worth, I don't know. We're getting into psychology here, which is outside my field. But, you know, I think that would be quite interesting. And I mean, the problem with that is, I mean, take Old Oak Common. You might do that in Old Oak Common. You know, I guarantee you, you're waiting 30 years before you in a project like that, to start to engage with that sort of agenda, probably, because it's such a long-term project.
But doesn't it have to be baked in from the beginning?
Well, ideally, it needs to be baked in from the beginning. And, you know, you could say, we've done this with the Olympics. It worked, actually. I mean, maybe, you know, we don't, perhaps, I'm jumping to conclusions there. Maybe you need to study it and prove to yourself that it's worked. I would just say it's worked and get on with it. And then take it apart. I mean, as you are doing, take it apart and say, right, yeah, we can put this back together again, here, and start to sort of link. I say, you know, link because London is growing, as I said before. We all know London's growing, but there are 2 or 3 fundamental issues behind all this. One is quality jobs that pay a living wage. None of this is new to you, you know. One of it is housing. I mean, it's in there in the affordable housing in the SRF or the whatever in the Convergence report. So some of this is we know is going to be very difficult to tackle, but you know it starts to. I think it starts to deliver, I think, some sort of sense of what can we take out of this exercise.
I think for me that's the major area that I hope the Convergence plan can give to the Mayor to work on. What do we take away? London will always have an opportunity. It might not be as big as the Olympics, but if we can understand what worked, why it worked, then we can have the package, the tactic to move to other parts of London. But
yeah, well, Sean has kind of given a backdrop to my question, which is sort of concluding question, that we obviously have got this very special program, you know, with the Olympics being the big player and so on, and the new strategy put in place from 2015. Question is, what lessons are there to be learned, and whether this unique sub-regional regeneration sort of concept and program, that this is something which can be replicated or can help other regeneration programs in other parts of London?
I think it's the main thing is by taking a really long-term view, and you know the Convergence strategy was to be over 20 years.
Yeah.
I mean, there hadn't been a regeneration strategy that was taking that sort of long-term view before and thought it could actually, you know, turn indicators around. But there are lots of hurdles to achieve that. But I think that's the single most important thing. I mean, what city challenges were 5 years, SRBs were 7, and the housing areas were 10.
Area action trusts, yeah.
But to keep sustained effort, not get bored and want to go on to the next new thing constantly, but actually have a 20-year plan to make real change happen and make sure that no one is left behind. I think that's the biggest thing to try and learn.
And do you
And
reckon...
I'm not saying we've been successful at it. We're only 10 years in, and you know, interest is waning. But I do think that you do need 20 years to actually change an area that's got deep and profound deprivation in it,
And
for
this
the
would
benefit
be,
of the people there.
yeah, a program such as this would be as much relevant to, let's say, outer London areas which are obviously facing substantial amount of growth,
Yeah.
economic, housing and so on. Yeah. Ralph, Graham,
Well,
any thoughts on that?
You say it, okay. I'm just repeating.
Yeah, just to reiterate what Liz said about
Yeah.
don't underestimate the scale of the challenge, especially some of the indicators you're looking at, especially health, activity and things like that, take sort of decades to achieve, don't they? I think physical activity rates might have been a bit of a hostage to fortune, but maybe they thought they had to do it in the convergence criteria because it was an Olympic promise. But there's always very limited evidence about how you could achieve that through hosting an elite sporting event. So maybe someone needs to reinvigorate that, do some pilots on what actually works, what's worked in cycling and things like that to roll that out and get people more involved in sports across the piece. I think that'd be my main thought on that.
And my point is basically what I've said, I suppose. How we can build on the opportunity that's locally, engage the process of growth with local opportunities and access through, you know, quite I would say close management of it. But I'm thinking, for example, what's happening now in the Olympic Park. I mean, these things go ongoing. Now we've got these. Well, one hopes. I wait and see it appearing finally. The cultural centre, the UCL. That can generate a whole new agenda of growth around it. I've certainly been at meetings. We've been holding meetings with the local artists and cultural community and how they might engage with all this coming in their midst. You know, that you speak to some of the new investors or new institutions, you'd think that they were, it was a new, culture was new to the area, but of course it's heaving with artists and creativity and that those sort of skills. So how do we build on that? You know, so this idea of becoming active and interventionist, you know, this is not music to some ears, but it's where I came from and it seemed to work. Being interventionist in helping to build, to create impact and shape the impact. That's what we learned. That's what we did with the Olympics. Now, whether it's possible, the Olympics was a very special event because it had all this kind of excitement and public commitment associated with it, and I don't know whether you can ever recreate that again with you know, building Battersea Power Station or doing something out in the Royal Docks. But it seems to me that if the mayor and the GLA kind of develops this, as this is the modus operandi of this city, you know, this is what we're going to do in this city, and this is what we expect in this city. I mean, at the moment you've got these area planning frameworks, you know, which are very beautiful, but they don't, you know, they're not practical, sort of, you know. So, you know, I think about, well, Nicky will laugh when she hears this because we talked about this 17 years ago when the GLA was set up and I was working for the LDA about a capacity for the GLA to have a kind of interventionist skills that can get in amongst these processes and these developers and local communities. And and kind of shape and push along this process of engagement. I don't know if I'm making sense at all in this.
Are you saying that we don't do it enough?
I couldn't say because I'm not really in this network anymore.
Are you saying we
But
do
I
it
said
more?
my sense is that it's very much a planning thing rather than a urban growth thing, as I know. But maybe it's going on. Maybe it is happening, and it's, in which case perhaps it could be. Formalised is the wrong word, but you know, this becomes a part of your toolkit to achieve more equity in the city. Because it's a very difficult, you know, inequity has been a feature of, is a feature of every bloody city in the world. You ought to read a book called Planet of Slums, which is an extraordinary book by, you know, we're very lucky as a world city to have the levels of inequity that we have, quite honestly. So maybe we should just accept what we've got and carry on. But I think that there's an agenda here which this could be the leitmotif of this city, really, about how growth, we only want growth if it's going to bring clear value to some of those people who are currently not benefiting from access to modern opportunities. Easily said, more difficultly done, I know.
Okay.
I think Ray's put his finger on what the Mayor is striving for in terms of a city for all Londoners, and so all Londoners are benefiting within the concept of good growth. I mean, it's very much with this equalities, equity theme running through it.
But isn't there a tension? The more successful we become at that, the more successful we'll have to be, because London already is suffering from its own success. We have too many people because we deliver lots of money, people are doing well, but that's also generating the big problems we have. The reason I'm stuck on churn is because London has massively prospered, but parts of it haven't. And every time some part does a little bit better, they just send their poor east. And what are we going to do about that? And the better we become and more attractive place we become, surely that will just be the perennial problem, a bigger problem. At some point, how will we answer the success we're having? Because people come to London now because the chances are you'll do quite well. But that means there's always a group of Londoners who will be left behind.
I've got no answer.
What you might...
That's been happening in capital cities for hundreds of years.
Absolutely, I accept that.
What you might
As
like
we all
to
get
look
on
at
our
there,
bike or our train or our whatever.
I know. I just say that's
Yeah.
our big problem. The better we do, the better we have to do.
Yeah.
what you can do is in a previous iteration, the indices of multiple deprivation, they developed a typology of some of the most deprived quintiles. So you could identify at the lower super output area a sort of what kind of communities they were. So I think this is a report DCLG did in about 2009. And so what you'd be looking at, if something was an escalator area, I can't remember the exact definitions, or a transit area, it's less of a problem. But if it's what they termed an isolate that's stuck in that rut, then that's more of a problem. So maybe we could replicate some of that kind of analysis and see where particular localised problems were in the host boroughs and how we could address them, what the particular circumstances were, follow that up with some qualitative research and see if particular interventions were needed there.
I just want to say, Sean, that in 2000, when the London Plan was, its first vision set out, and then the policy frameworks, the context for action, one of the main ideas behind the London Plan was to redress the huge historical imbalances in wealth and particularly opportunities between East and West. And this area that we're talking about, the good growth boroughs, was the area, sorry, not good, well, they would be good, the idea is good growth now, the growth boroughs, but the whole idea is that area was the biggest concentration of communities with, dire deprivation in all Western Europe. And that's what, and the London Plan didn't have the Olympics in it, because at that stage we didn't know if the government would back it, although that's what we wanted. And in fact, the whole of the plan is based on, to a certain extent, making sure that the East is going to be able to, that we're going to address those imbalances, which are left by, the port moving out and the new port being the airport and so on. But massive differences. And now you can see, and the Olympics came along, fortunately, as a catalyst to what already was in the plan. But as Rafe's been saying, it would have taken much, much longer without that massive catalyst in terms of investment. And I just, I'm just interested in how there are lessons to be learnt, but how we're going to be able to get that effect with much less investment now.
And in other areas, when you don't have...
in other areas,
such
I'm
a
talking about
magnet.
other areas, of
There's
course.
poverty
yeah.
all over London.
Yeah.
No, we agree there's poverty all over London, but there was this intense
I don't know.
concentration of poverty.
And none of the Olympics, 7 billion, 8 billion, 9 billion, 10 billion, none of that money, that was spent on the Olympic Park. And it didn't go to the community particularly. It went indirectly. I mean, there's a wonderful...
Oh, and on transport.
It's mostly all there. We charted up the overground and built a little bit of DLR, but that's not the kind of the end of the world, is it?
Electric power underground, so the housing above it could be better quality and good housing above it, instead of,
Yes,
estates
yes,
with
yes.
overhead power cables.
No, but the point I'm making is that
That wouldn't
the cost was on the Olympic Games rather than on the programmes that
But
went around it.
we have
So maybe
benefited from infrastructure and, the early sort of funding, the investment that it got. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen that. Anyway, unless there is anything else that our guests would like to contribute, we have come to a conclusion to our discussion. On behalf of this committee, I'd like to thank our guests for their very positive contribution. We still have some business to conduct of the committee. You feel free to stay on, or not a problem if you have to leave. So with that note, once again, thanks for your time, and please do give us further feedback in writing if there's anything else that you reckon you do want to add to our work. Thank you once again. Yeah. Members, can we note the report in the discussion with the invited guests?
No.
Thank you. And can we also delegate authority to me in consultation with the Deputy Chairman to agree any output from this review? Okay, thank you very much. Next item is our committee's work program. Can we agree on updated work program as set out in this report, 4.1 to 4.7 paragraphs? And can we delegate authority to me, again in consultation with Deputy Chairman, to agree the scope and terms of reference for the committee scrutiny review of Brent Cross, which is our next big project, and arrangements for a site visit as part of that scrutiny review.
Agreed.
Okay, and finally note that arising from our report on digital connectivity in London, we had an informal discussion with representatives from Transport for London. This happened yesterday about digital connectivity and what TfL is doing to improve connectivity in London on 5th of September 2017. I have asked TfL to give us their formal response in light of discussions we've had, so that that can formally be fed into our work. Two more items. Date of next meeting, that is to be held on 21st of 2017, which is a Tuesday at 10 a.m. in the chamber of City Hall. And last item of business, any other business which I consider urgent. There is no such business, so I'm pleased to conclude the meeting, and thank you very much for your attendance.